Hi, welcome for a special video that we have for you today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ron. I'm the policy coordinator here at the Beacon Center, and we have a special guest. We have Dr. Ben Stickle, who is one of our senior fellows for criminal justice. Dr. Stickle teaches at MTSU. How many years have you been there?
3 years.
3 years, awesome. And what we wanted to do today is just have a little bit of a special conversation about criminal justice reform and some of the issues in that space. But before we get into that, why don't you tell me a little bit about, I'm curious, prior to teaching at MTSU, you had a long career as a police officer, correct?
Yeah, I actually started volunteering in high school, doing some things in policing, and went to college, and after that did some security work and finally in policing. So it's been about 6 years, mainly in Kentucky, doing police work, and really enjoyed that, had a lot of benefit out of it, still miss it to some degree. Really enjoyed the people that I worked with, and the things that I got to do, and the folks I got to help. But really just began to feel like there was a little more that could be done than just simply arresting someone and putting them in jail. Looking to see how we could better everyone's experience, to make sure we had better outcomes. Because I got tired, as most cops will tell you, of seeming like you put the same people in jail over and over again, and not really being able to actually solve any of the issues. And so for a variety of reasons, I thought, if we could teach people to police better, help teach people learn to maybe behave a little bit better, to do some things better, we could move the ball forward rather than keep doing what we've been doing, which isn't always very successful.
And so that would lead into getting out of police force into the more academic side. What have been some of your research areas since you've been into teaching for the past several years?
I've looked at some use of force with law enforcement, trying to determine when that happens, what circumstances, some things like that. And I've looked at and begun to look at some issues with reentry in jails and prisons and work like that.
That's awesome. One of the things that we've worked on a lot here at Beacon is working in reentry. We were talking about last year finding better ways to re-incentivize reentry, so where groups are getting funding based upon merits and outcomes rather than just how many people are in jail or in prison. That leads an incentive to try and fill up prisons.
Sure.
So criminal justice used to be thought of as a left issue or a liberal issue, but in recent years we've seen red states and conservatives really take on this mantle of criminal justice reform as well, starting with Texas, you had Georgia, Kentucky, which have led, and then even with Governor Lee talked a lot on the campaign trail about making Tennessee a leader in criminal justice reform. I'm just curious, from your perspective, why do you think that criminal justice reform has become such a bipartisan issue when, especially in this day and age, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of issues that people from all angles can come together on?
Yeah, I think that criminal justice, especially reform, has a good home really in both sides of the party, at the camp, so to speak. Because you have the need to make sure that justice is actually being merited out to those who need it and not to those who don't. And that's really, doesn't really fall, I don't think, in either the left or right, conservative, liberal camps, but it really should be something that applies to both, and I think often does. And I think that allows room for both sides to discuss how do we make sure that the people who need punishment, who need correction, who need the services get them, and how do we keep the people who have gotten swept up into the system, who are not being served well by that system, from staying in it, because that can cause long-term more harm than it really does good. And so I think that's something very easy for both sides, and even the folks in the middle, to say, should we be doing some of these things? Should we be keeping people in a system for as long as they are? Does the outcomes from an arrest really benefit those who are arrested? And what's really going on, and look at this situation. And I think what started, really, if you look at a lot of the criminal justice system we have, comes from a more conservative standpoint. And so I think it makes sense that there would be a renewed interest to make sure we're doing it right and doing it well.
I think it's a really good point. One of the best ways I've ever heard it described is we need to separate those whom we're mad at versus whom we're scared of. And should we really treat those people the same way? And I think there's been a realization in recent years that we shouldn't treat those two groups the same, which is basically what we've been doing for quite a long time now.
I think that's a really good point. And what I find as I talk with folks and when I teach courses is that everyone thinks that when you give a type of crime, say a robbery or a burglary or something that somehow it's a stranger who kicks in your door and has a gun. And that does happen, and we do need to make sure that we control people who are violently behaving that way.
Right.
But what we forget is oftentimes it's a friend who came over who you thought left that came back and stole something. And there's a lot of other situations and circumstances dealing with these crimes that aren't the bright line, stereotypical, need to be frightened of type of crime and criminal, but we tend to put them all in the same box. And when we do that, we tend to over-punish those who don't need to be punished to that degree.
Right.
And maybe even under-punish some of those who we do need to punish more, who are a real threat to our society and safety. But we have a hard time, I think, as a society, figuring out who goes where, right?
Right.
Who should we be afraid of, and therefore need to have some control over.
And I think a lot of that realization is coming a lot due to the opioid crisis. I think some of these issues are really hitting people closer to home than they probably ever have in the past, because now it seems like everyone knows somebody who has been arrested or charged with some type of abuse or having medications that they shouldn't have. And so I think it's really opening up people's eyes. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I think the opioid crisis is really, as you said, let people become aware of how broad some of these issues are. And where people may have been standing and cheering, sending them all to prison, keep them there a long time, all of a sudden when it's your son or your neighbor or your cousin or your friend who's dealing with maybe having one too many prescription pills or letting someone borrow one, or just having a bad night and partaking. And the next thing you know, they're in a jail situation,
right,
facing federal charges, maybe facing felony charges, at risk of losing their job, and it just begins this spiral. And the real question is, are we helping anyone by putting them into that system?
Right.
And I think that's a good question that we all should be asking. And sometimes, as I said earlier, the case is yes, we should put people, control people. But at the same time, the question is, are we helping them by locking them away for, a drug offense, as you've mentioned? And I think those are the questions and debates that we have to answer. I can't sit here today and tell you the answer. It'd be great if I could. I don't have those types of answers. Right. But it's definitely questions that communities and states should be looking at to see how they want to respond to these issues.
Awesome. Well, getting a little bit back to reentry, I know you said that that's been a focus of yours and it's been a focus of ours here at Beacon. One of the reforms we've worked on in the past is re-incentivizing reentry programs where they're merit-based. One of the reforms that Beacon took on last year is reducing occupational licensing barriers for those re-entering society, because people could be denied a license to be a barber for stealing a six-pack of beer when they're in high school. Do we really need to make it harder for people to get jobs? Particularly when you talked about, arresting the same people over and over again. I think it's close to essentially 50% of people leaving prison will be back in there within 3 years. So I'm curious, what are some other things that we need to do to help better prepare those to reenter society? Because I think a lot of people don't realize that the vast majority of people who come out of the system or who are put into the system are going to be coming out at some point. The vast majority are coming out. They're not locked up or going to die in prison. So what are some things from your experience both on law enforcement side, but also on the research side, that you think that the system could change and improve?
That's a good question. I think we're just really beginning to appreciate some of the damage that occurs when we lock someone up, whether it can be even just a few days. Really, in the first 3 or 4 days, you start having family issues that start coming apart. Child care becomes an issue. And then you have the school after you because your children are truant, and that brings up a whole issue. You might lose your job within the first 2 or 3 days. And some people may listen to this and go, well, let's take a couple days of vacation, but a lot of people don't have that opportunity.
Right.
And so if you don't show up to work at your site, they'll find someone else. And the next thing you know, you're having trouble with your job, even if it doesn't require some type of licensure that you have to maintain. And so, that's a real issue, because anytime you take someone out of their normal functioning daily life and keep them from it, you are threatening their way of life.
Sure.
And that is a very serious and very difficult thing to get over. So it adds this other hurdle that now the person has to to meet. So now they have to move beyond maybe finding some help with an addiction or suffering some type of legitimate consequence for what they did, paying back if there was a damage, something of that nature. Now all of a sudden they have lost their job and so they can't do that. Or their driver's license has been suspended and they can't get to work legally. And so it just forces all these different decisions that now we have to make that only really compound the issue. And none of those things have helped the situation.
Right.
None of those are punishments that we think we should give to someone, but they're just a result of the way that we apply the law.
Almost like collateral damage, essentially.
I think it really is, and as a result of that, the family suffers, and that's a horrible situation, and relationships suffer, and so there's a lot of those issues that come together, and then you have the issues that really shouldn't be ignored. That can you prepare for a case as well when you're in a jail or a prison as when you're out? And the answer is likely no. And then even just the restrictions, some of the greatest things that can keep recidivism down that have been found through research are work, employment, and then communication with family and loved ones while you're in, so that you're ready when you are able to come out, whether that's a couple of days or several weeks or months. And the current criminal justice system really retards that ability. And so it's very hard to keep your job. It's very hard. And then even just the communication. So even just something as simple as being able to see your children while you're incarcerated, or to write them a letter, or to even receive a letter from them. It can be very, very taxing. And when you start distancing those relationships, you find more and more who will recidivate, because when they come out, those helpful relationships have just disappeared.
It makes a lot of sense, though. Growing up in the Army, I remember my dad was deployed, and just having to have those long times and distance of communication, is a stress on any family, but, especially when you're there when you don't want to be, obviously.
Right.
I can't imagine it makes it even worse. So. And
there's no convenience either.
Absolutely.
So, I was trying to write an inmate of a jail recently, and realized that this jail only allows handwritten letters. And the last one preferred typed, and so now the letters that I sent got returned, and I have to go back and handwrite them, and so
that's government inefficiency, only allowing handwritten letters, if you ask me.
It could be, and some of that is understandable. They have a legitimate safety interest to keep things in and out of that jail that way, right?
Makes sense.
And so they don't want paper coming in that's laced with something. But at the same token, the question comes, and this is where I don't have the answer. The question comes, is it better to allow increased levels of communication than it is to take a risk of maybe every once in a while, very infrequently, some type of harmful substance comes in? And those are questions that don't have a good answer, and that each jurisdiction, each agency, each state has to come up with. But we need to keep in mind that the goal is to maintain that contact as much as we can, not to completely remove it, because then we find that people don't reintegrate into society like we want them to.
Interesting. Switching gears a little bit, one of the things that Beacon has taken on for the first time is more on the pretrial side of the criminal justice system, because as you know, the criminal justice system I kind of liken it to immigration, where there's so many different moving parts and pieces of it. It's not just fixing criminal justice reform. And so let's just talk a little bit on the other side about pretrial. One of the issues that we have in Tennessee is massive jail overcrowding, people who haven't been convicted, and yet we have this mantra or this maxim in the United States of innocent until proven guilty. But in Tennessee, we've got 15,000 people sitting in jail, 5,000 of which are misdemeanors. They're nonviolent crimes. They're sitting in there. They're not paying taxes, or they're not going to work. They're going to job. They're losing, falling behind on rent. And it's also very expensive for taxpayers. We're talking almost $200,000 a year just for those pretrial misdemeanors. So what are some ways that you've seen in your research or whatnot to address this issue of this pretrial population and this jail overcrowding? Because one of the things that we hear when we talk with lawmakers, and particularly at the local level across the state, is it's unsustainable. It's just too expensive. But it's difficult to find ways to make sure that you're addressing public safety, which is the number one priority of the system, but also saving taxpayer money. What's some of your thoughts?
I think some of the things that you all have focused on already are really key to looking at this. And the questions really come down to who needs to go to jail, like immediately.
Right.
Because when you talk about pretrial, we're not talking about prison, we're not talking about after sentence, we're talking about before really the trial, or before a plea or a guilty or anything like that. So the question is, who needs to actually go to jail to stay? And I think clearly, and I don't think anyone would say that your dangerous, violent offenders probably do need to spend the night in jail,
right.
and let the circumstances play out later on how that happens. The same is true for someone who's intoxicated and is causing some type of problem. So there's definitely those who we need to keep. But the real question comes is, what about all the others? What about all those who maybe it was a minor trespass violation or a minor drug violation, or a cold check, or you know, something like that isn't endangering someone's property, as in themselves, their lives, and may not even be endangering someone's actual property. We have a huge number of crimes that would even be described as sometimes victimless, right? Crimes where there isn't a clear victim, and yet those are tend to be a lot of the crimes that we put people into jail for. And if they're not endangering society, they're not endangering someone else, they're not endangering someone's property, then the question is, why do we put them in jail? Well, sometimes that's because it seems to be the automatic thing to do, right? You're the police, you put someone in jail. That's how I felt often. But the answer is that doesn't have to be the case. And an officer has a great amount of discretion to choose whether to charge anyone at all, and then in some cases whether to issue them a citation, which is basically a court appointment, saying you have to appear in court in this day and answer the charges, or to take them to jail. And providing officers the ability to do that, the tools and the proper legal code to be free to do that, is a huge way to allow officers to say, you know, I don't think you're a danger to society. We're going to give you a court date, and you should come on this date and face the judge and see what goes on from there, is a huge way to try and reduce that pre-trial population that is in jail. And I'll just add real quickly to it, the expense is probably larger than what you said. So if you consider, you know, a lot of areas of this state that are rural, you have a minor shoplifting, and you make an arrest, and it takes 45 minutes to drive to the jail. And then it takes an hour to process that person, and then a 45-minute drive for the officer back to their jurisdiction. And so you're looking at 2 or 3 hours worth of time when that officer is not responding to calls. They're not available for help.
Patrolling.
Instead, they're taking someone who maybe, very likely, isn't going to cause any of their problems that day, who could be given a court appointment. So there's not only value in protecting the individual who needs to go to court, but also preserving the time that allows officers who are overworked, very busy, to actually be out protecting from other things that do occur.
So I liken it to when you get a speeding violation, getting a warning versus a ticket. Not that I've ever experienced that or anything, you know, but having that discretion to get that warning. But more seriously, though, we have to make sure that all the areas of the code are consistent and to allow for that discretion to happen. Earlier, you and I were talking about how in Tennessee law, it says, hey, there are certain crimes that you can give that citation for, but you can only issue the citation if you're absolutely certain that they'll show up for court, which kind of asks the police officer to look into the future with a crystal ball, and that doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. So it's making sure that all the sections of the code really streamlined to allow that police officer who's there in the moment to have that discretion and to utilize their best judgment.
And I think you raised, you know, a really important point, and I say this very often with people I talk with students, and with anyone who will listen to me, is that what we forget is that we have police officers who 99% of them do a really good job and want to do well. And sometimes we get really angry about the choices that officers make, but we forget that it starts with the legislature. That it comes from somewhere. They are given the authority, the direction to do X, and then they go out and they do that. And when you have legislation that may just be a little bit confusing, not easy to understand, or requires really more than probably what was intended, that creates problems. And so the example that you're giving, it could be very difficult for an officer to feel responsible to make a judgment call on whether that person will attend court. And that can be very difficult to do, and very concerning for an officer who'd rather just err on the side of caution and take the person to jail, because that's the easier thing to do, less likely to get in trouble.
Sure.
Because it just makes sense. And so when you have a legislation that's written in such a way that can be a little bit difficult to understand, or just difficult to really prove, well, these are the 6 reasons I think they're going to stay, or these are the 3 reasons I think they'll leave, officers tend to err on the side of arrest because it's just the easier thing to do. So having a very clear understanding for law enforcement over when they are allowed to arrest, when it's preferred, under what circumstances, and tightening up the verbiage really will and should help officers to make better decisions. We're not wanting to take away anyone's ability to make an arrest. I mean, no one wants that. But allowing them to have the freedom to make a choice that they feel is necessary for the safety of society and that is most effective for the justice system. And it's the same going back to what you just said about getting a ticket. Sometimes it's better to give a warning, sometimes a ticket's better. And we're pay and train officers to know that difference. And so allowing them to do that better is ultimately going to increase their ability to do their job well.
Awesome. Well, to wrap it up here, it's March Madness. Everyone's got their pools. I know you studied at Louisville, right, for a master's and doctorate.
Right.
They had a bad loss the other day. Did you ever go to a game at the KFC Yum Center when you studied there?
Yep.
Awesome. I think it's pretty cool. Even though it was, I'm sure, a taxpayer-funded stadium downtown for a college, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me or to us, but I'll just kind of throw it out. Do you have a bracket or favorite memory at Louisville from a sports standpoint, or who you're rooting for this tournament?
I'm surprisingly not a huge sports fan.
Okay.
But the moment that I became one was several years ago when I had a statistics class.
Okay.
And I didn't really enjoy statistics.
Until you watched sports, yes.
Until the president said, if we get into the Final Four, we're going to cancel classes on Monday night.
Interesting.
And I was cheering very hard for
Really?
Louisville to win, so they would cancel class.
Interesting. Well,
And they did.
They did. Is that the year they
worked
won?
well. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow. Too bad. I don't know what. I guess they got that whole coaching thing that's sent them downhill since then.
Yeah, that's been a bump.
Yeah. Anyways, well, thank you for listening in and watching our special video today, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.